change.
Greatest engineering undertakings in the history.
Freedom came under attack.
To be self-evident.
Welcome participants. This is the introductory video on the Holocaust, and I want to talk about the Holocaust as a kind of a constant radicalization of ever worsening measures by the Nazis that then ended in mass murder. If we think about the persecution of Jews before the Holocaust, here too we have a constant radicalization. One thing that of course stands out is Kristallnacht in 1938, where the synagogues were burned down all over Germany, and that's what this picture is showing here. And you can see people looking on, so this is in kind of very much in the public eye. But clearly there are earlier antecedents to this. One of the greatest changes is that the Nazis and other before them morph religious anti-Semitism, what's been there in Germany, of course, for centuries, into a much more radical racial anti-Semitism. This happens at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And the Nazis, of course, make use of this disastrous ideology. Furthermore, the Nazis tie that in with a sense that Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I, which is an absurd thing to say, because after all, German Jews fought for Germany with the same determination as non-Jewish Germans did. After the takeover of power in 1933, there were immediately first measures against Jews. For example, a boycott against Jewish shops in April 1933. It is interesting at this point the German public, though probably many of them had anti-Semitic prejudices, did not go along. This boycott had to be called off because of lack of public support. Germans continued to buy at Jewish shops just as they had before. However, 2 years later, the 1935 Nuremberg law segregates society. The citizens of Jews is revoked, intermarriage is banned, and there is no public outcry against that. So just in 2 years, society has been segregated enough for Germans to accept the Nuremberg race laws. The Nuremberg race laws are also not one kind of set of rules, but they're a constant barrage of ever worsening rules and regulations, one of which, for example, continues to ostracize Jews further, to exclude them from the professions, from public and cultural life. So it goes on and on and on, these constant rules. And it's in 1939 that we have open persecution, really the burning of the synagogues, but also really violence against Jews on the streets. That's in the open eye for anyone to see, and it also goes along with the plunder of Jewish property. So, for example, many Jews had to emigrate out of Germany. Of course, they wanted to get out. They had to leave their possessions behind. These possessions were sold at public auction, and many normal Germans may have had reservations against these things, but they still benefited from them by purchasing these plundered goods. If we then think about this kind of constant radicalization that goes through the steps of segregation, of ostracism, of open persecution in Kristallnacht, then at the same time we also already start that murder takes place. Yes, about 250 people were murdered during Kristallnacht, but a more systematic approach was already taken towards a different group, and that was people with hereditary diseases who were combined in the so-called T4 program and who were murdered. What's interesting here is that, again, the German public failed to respond to that in any kind of meaningful way or to protest it. Noteworthy, though, is the intervention of a bishop, Bishop von Galen in Münster, who really from the pulpit voiced resistance and even was partially successful because the Nazis then suspended for some time the program. And in many ways, we can think about the T4 program as a trial run for organized murder. But at the same time, this does not mean that there were plans for the murder of all Jews before 1940. Clearly, Hitler had written about the Jewish question, as he would call it, and very many of the words that he used can be associated with murder, yet no clear program existed. So we have to think about a kind of a simultaneous coexistence of different, often contradictory measures. The SS, for example, might still in 1940 encourage German Jews to immigrate, but at the same time it already starts creating ghettos in Poland that are, of course, labor exploitation, but clearly also the conditions there are so bad on purpose so that many people will die in these ghettos. So these are conflicting policies that coexist at the same time. However, with the war, all of these measures get increasingly worse. The creation of ghettos in Poland, we have that sometime late in 1939, but then especially a year later in autumn 1940, that intensifies. And that builds in murder through malnutrition and diseases. Yet the goal was not the murder of all Jews of Europe at this point, but it was the labor exploitation and decimation murder built in, but not yet as radical as the Holocaust, the murder of each and every Jewish person in Europe. At the same time, also, these so-called Einsatzgruppen, which were mobile SS squads, roamed Eastern Europe, and they started to murder Jews and the intelligentsia, the leadership in the occupied countries in Eastern Europe, particularly then after Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, and these two images that you see here on the left-hand side is an entrance to a ghetto guarded by Germans. And on the other hand, that's an epitome of the Einsatzgruppen, this Einsatzgruppen participant shooting over an open pit. This person who has no way of defending himself. However, yet there is still another step to the organized, planned, and industrialized murder that is executed in the Holocaust. These Einsatzgruppen have many, many victims. Over 1 million people were shot by the Einsatzgruppen, but this is still a genocide by bullets, and there is in no way an idea that they can murder each and every Jewish person in Europe. The extermination camps, of which the most notorious is Auschwitz that you see here in this picture, have precisely this purpose. And in various meetings, 1941 and 1942, the SS and other German bureaucracies planned what they called the final solution, the murder of all Jewish, but also, by the way, of Romani people who are often pejoratively referred to as gypsies. The SS then also could rely on not only the smooth collaboration of many German bureaucracies, but also local police and bureaucracies in those countries occupied by Germany. For example, French police rounded up French Jews. They did not participate in the murder of them, but if they rounded them up and deported them, they were assistants to a crime, of course, committed by Germany. These plans for the murder of all Jewish people, what the Nazis called the final solution, clashed, however, with goals of labor exploitation of Jewish and other people. However, if we see as the war progressed, more and more those advocating for even more radical, even more murderous steps got the upper hand. And the German public was well aware of the deportation of Jews, which mostly happened really in broad daylight. I mean, people were herded to the train stations. You could see that it was not in any secrecy. And while people did not know whether or not those deported would be murdered in the East, clearly they tacitly accepted that the Jews would meet a grim fate there and at least would be exploited for labor. However, also many rumors spread from soldiers on the front lines who witnessed the atrocities, some even participated, from German bureaucracies operating in the East who were talking about these murders taking place. So it is pretty clear that many Germans suspected or even knew that the deportations led to murder. Still, ordinary Germans failed to register any disagreement or protest, and that one of the reasons why that is the case is that many had already become accomplices to the crime as beneficiaries of Aryanization, of the plunder of Jewish goods. What I want to stress about the extermination camp, and again Auschwitz is the most notorious of them, is that they were really factories of death, organized for the purposing of murdering vast numbers of people while selecting few for labor exploitation in nearby factories or medical experimentation. Their most important feature is that they were rationally planned. It's almost an industrial design. The main purpose was to murder people as efficiently as possible. It's almost like a factory. The trains come in, people are unloaded, they're selected by an expert, by an SS doctor, whether they were to be murdered immediately or whether they would be kept alive to exploit their labor. From there on, people were herded into the gas chambers that looked like showers. In these gas chambers, people were murdered. Then there was an elevator that would transport bodies to the crematoria. So this is an industrialized process based on ideas of efficiency. That is why, and that's an argument that has been made by the very famous Holocaust scholar Zygmunt Bauman, that the Auschwitz, this part of the Holocaust, this industrialized murder, speaks to Western modernity, because our Western modernity is also informed by consideration of scientific exploration and efficiency. Having said that, though, bear in mind that many victims of German atrocities never saw a concentration camp in sight, but they were murdered in more archaic ways, such as shooting, hunger, and deprivation in the ghettos or through the Einsatzgruppen. So this kind of industrialized murder is a part of the Holocaust, a very important one, but it is really the final step, whereas there are other much more archaic forms of murder present as well. Thinking about, and that's the last point I want to make, the victims in particular, then of course the Nazis persecuted Jews with particular zeal and murdered about 6 million Jews all over Europe. However, other groups were persecuted as well. First, it was the political opposition in Germany and occupied countries, whether they were communists, socialists, some church leaders, and other oppositional groups. However, there are also the victims of euthanasia, who we mentioned earlier, people with disabilities. There were religious groups persecuted, such as Jehovah's Witnesses. There were homosexuals persecuted. Of course, also the Romani people, if you think about, again, in pejorative terms, we shouldn't be using this term, but gypsies were murdered with equal zeal than the Jews. Many non-Jewish Poles and other Slavic people were murdered even at the same places such as Auschwitz, or were forced to go as slave laborers to go to Germany. Soviet civilians and Soviet prisoners of war, the latter group was starved to death by the German military, taking fully into account that their planning of a blitzkrieg, of a lightning war in Eastern Europe would generate thousands and millions of casualties, and they made no provisions for these people, taking into account that they would die. The same goes for the civilian population. When Germany, for example, besieged Leningrad, the point was to starve the population of Leningrad. So, of course, again, the Holocaust takes a special place in the history of World War II, but German atrocities were not only committed against Jews, but to a wide array of people.